Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for taking the time on this bright and sunny morning for FI 2016 in Berlin. My name's Guy Long. I'm a representative of the manufacturer Curvebeam. I'm part of Curvebeam Europe. I'm the Director of Operations. Here we have Professor Martinus Richter as well, who's going to be presenting some of our clinicians who are going to be presenting some of their experiences and uses with the PEDCAT. This is our first scientific user meeting, which I'm very pleased to announce has been held in Europe. It's going to be a very interesting discussion where each of our clinicians are going to present their experiences and future research opportunities with the PEDCAT. Each doctor will then present their 6 or 7 minute presentation, and then we will have an open discussion between us to discuss future innovations and research ideas between us. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Martinus Richter, who's going to open his presentation with the PEDCAT for radiographic 3D imaging in the standing position, and then he'll be handing over to the next presenter. Over to you, Professor Richter.
Thank you, Guy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be part of this first scientific user meeting, and the audience exactly meets my expectations. It's always like that. When you start with something like that, you're among yourselves. So what we have here, the speakers, people from the company, the distributors, and 1 or 2 interested people. But it's always like that at the beginning, and I think still it's a good start. And we had workshops and we had presentations yesterday, and I thought it would be a good idea that a user group would meet, not from the very beginning, but after a few years, to exchange their opinions and to make plans for the future. For example, how to measure something, because now we have publications out there, only very few, but still in these few publications we see that one group is measuring like that, the other group is measuring like that. And so the idea was that we show each of us the scientific results very briefly, and I was insisting on 5 minutes instead of 6 or 7, that we have at the end time for discussion. And maybe you have heard some of the results before, so maybe this repeats, but now in this room you have all the results at the same time. So we have 6 speakers in total, and I will start because I'm standing here, and then my proposal is that we go through the presentations and do a discussion afterwards. And the presentations are not focused on the technology and what you can do with it, but only on research. So I can just present briefly the results of 2 studies. So the first studies, we compared measurements, angular measurements of bones between standard radiographs, 3D imaging, CT without weight bearing, and PEDCAT with weight bearing. And the methods, 30 patients, and we had standard weight bearing radiographs, as you can see here. The type of imaging that we do and that we did in all our patients, CT without weight bearing and the PEDCAT. So we analyzed the time spent of the image acquisition, not of the analysis of the images with the angular bone measurement, and you can see here the different angles we measured. And we had 3 different investigators, and they measured 3 times each angle, and so far we did also an analysis regarding objectivity and reliability. We did an Anova with post-hoc Jeffet test. Here is an example. So by now we have to measure by hand. So we did it by hand with the software, of course, by hand for each radiographs, CT, and PEDCAT with the standard software that was available for these 3 imaging types. And to be sure that it's really a reliable measurement, we did 3 investigators 3 times. The time spent for the image acquisition was the first surprise. So radiographs in our hands, in our hospital, is the longest. PEDCAT the fastest, and CT in the middle. Radiographs are a little bit cumbersome in our hospital because to do weight-bearing radiographs, you need this step here. And for the metatarsal skyline view, you have this device here, and that's the reason why it takes so long. But even if you have your film holder down on the floor and you can stand on the floor, I'm sure that in other studies the radiographs would even also be slower than with a PEDCAT. Now the results, not surprising with the Anova analysis, because Anova Analysis compares all three at a time. And we had, again, CT without weight bearing in the group. So it's no surprise that we have highly significant differences in the entire group. And then we had a postdoc test, Chefet test, PET-CAT versus X-ray and CT, and that's a surprise. Not that PET-CAT is completely different to CT, that's expected because of the missing weight bearing, but also to standard radiographs. For example, for the first, second intermetatarsal angle, PET-CAT versus X-ray, highly significant differences in the angle. Also for the TMT angles, hindfoot angle, and not for the calcaneal pitch angle, which we measured on a lateral radiograph. This is obviously on a lateral radiograph, we have no problems with projection or positioning. So if you have differences, you don't know which is right and wrong. And then when we look into details, from a technical standpoint, only PET-CAT has the 3D volume, no problems with the foot positioning, no problems with the projection. So from this standpoint, only the PET-CAT could measure the real angles in the foot. I don't say that the measurements on the X-ray are nonsense, but when you're interested in angles between two bones that are in the three-dimensional room, only this technology could measure the correct. I call it PET-CAT here all the time, but you also can use another device with full weight bearing in 3D. Second study, then we saw the correlation between forces and pressures, and the bone position would be a good idea. And now, same principle, 50 patients this time, 8 PET-CAT parameters, 8 pedography parameters. We made a special sensor to put inside the PET-CAT, and we measured these angles, as you've known before, and the height of different bones, sesamoid, metatarsal heads, and proximal metatarsal, as you can see here. And then we correlated especially the height of the metatarsal heads and the sesamoid with pedography, which is an automatic measurement. And when you look into single patients, it looks clear. The bone is further closer to the floor, and you have higher pressure. But when we analyzed the entire group, we didn't find a sufficient correlation, and sufficient means for me, first, significant. So it must be 0.05, the p-value, or lower. And to have I think you called it yesterday, first-class correlation, it must be more than 0.8, the r-value, or less than minus 0.8. And we couldn't find that in a single one. There are only three significant, but a low correlation coefficient. And even so, for the height of the metatarsals and the pressure, no correlation for the entire group. So that was quite disturbing. Again, the PET-CAT measurements are reliable. It's not like we measured wrong. And the 3D bone position does not correlate with force and pressure in this study, in this setting. It means static pedography and bipedal stent. And there are different things you can discuss. Case number too low, unipedal versus bipedal stent, static versus dynamic pedography, other parameters, and so on. So I don't know, and I'm looking forward to your input later on. But the conclusion is then, from X-ray alone or radiographic imaging, you cannot conclude completely to forces and pressures. So you need somehow pedography. And if you say, I have pedography, I don't need radiographs, it's also wrong, because you have more information from radiographs that are different. So both are useful somehow. That was our main conclusion. And for the future, I see dynamic measurement, of course, automatic 3D angular measurement, planning software, scan of the entire body and dynamic, please. And integration of pedography, of course, and I think this could be the future. But now we are here, and I'm interested to hear what the other contributors could tell us. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to hand over now to Dr. Arne Bersen from Belgium.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me on this interesting PET-CAT scientific user meeting. This presentation will show some of our research results obtained after using the PET-CAT in hind feet. As an introduction, it has made clear now that weight-bearing CT is more accurate than plain radiographs. This mainly by overcoming superposition and avoiding rotational errors. It's a cone beam CT, which means low dose. And the first thing we did was describe a method to determine hindfoot alignment using weight-bearing CT. And therefore, we investigated 60 malalignments of the hindfoot, 30 valgus and 30 varus cases. Here we will show the result of the valgus cases. And we determined our hindfoot alignment using the anatomical axis of the tibia and the talocalcaneal axis, as you can see here. And for this, we used the inferior point of our calcaneus, as described by Salzman. But we had on top of that the talus, which is now clearly visible using the PET-CAT CT, because before using only plain radiographs, this was clearly superimposed and wasn't pretty difficult to measure. We correlated this angle, and the intersection of both became our hindfoot angle, and this we correlated to the clinical surface reconstructional images. But before we could determine our hindfoot alignment, it was important to position correctly the foot according to 3 planes and align it with the second ray. And then we could obtain our results, and we saw that there was a good correlation with this clinical reconstructional images, and we also found a good reliability analysis. And also we found a good correlation with the talar shift, which is the deviation from your talus towards the neutral axis, and this can aid you preoperatively to obtain, again, a corrective osteotomy in line with the neutral axis. But our angles didn't have any reference values, and that's why we looked at the literature, what was described before for a normal hindfoot angle. And this was situated between 2 degrees and 6 degrees of valgus in the general population. But these results are solely based on clinical measurements and only plain radiographs, which we know are prone of making measurement errors. Therefore, we used the weight-bearer CT in a normal population group. And for us, this cohort were patients who sustained minor ankle trauma, for example, when they had an ankle sprain at the emergency department and the radiograph was negative, but they still had complaints and there was suspicion of an occult fracture. Then the patients received the cone beam CT because that was more, it was better for the dose radiation compared to a normal CT. We used our method as described previously, and we found more neutral alignments. It was not the valgus alignment that was stated previously, but we found a more neutral alignment with 0.97 degrees of valgus, so it deviates a bit from the previous findings. And what was interesting is that when we draw this mechanical axis, that it comes down most of times in the area of this inferior point of the calcaneus. This was also already mentioned by Salzman, but it's an interesting finding to pose that maybe a hindfoot malalignment should be referred to this mechanical axis. But this method remains manual. As you can see here, you have to select your points yourself before you start measuring. Therefore, we thought how we can make it more accurate and start talking to clinical engineers of Materialize, and they aided us in translating these divisor points towards more mathematically derived pinpoints. So as you can see here in this inferior point of the calcaneus, which we previously just determined by divisor, now gets mathematically calculated, which give us more accurate results. And also it can help in determining more biomechanical relevant points, such as your center of gravity of your calcaneus and your talus. These were results of our cohort group. It showed good Gaussian distribution, which means it was a good study group, and we had a good agreement in our 2D, 3D angle measurement angles. And our last project is situated in pre- and post-operative corrections. As you can see here, pre-operatively, we measure a hindfoot angle of 15.2 degrees of valgus, as you can see here. And during our surgery, we only used a procedure which consists out of a calcaneal sliding osteotomy. We didn't do any tendon procedures, and therefore we only used a step plate of 80 millimeters. So this means the heel bone gets 8 millimeters translated, and as you can see here, this gives a correction towards 8.4 degrees of valgus, which is around the distance that you use for the step plate. So For the moment, this rule of thumb of translating 1 millimeter is in accordance with 1 degree. But we think with further cases, this will be more accurately determined. So as a conclusion, the PETCAT definitely changed the way we look at hindfoot pathology. This by overcoming the superposition and rotational errors. And our hindfoot measurement method can be determined both in deformities in a normal feet and in post-operative corrections. But it remains manual, so that's why we started to translate it to 3D models. And we think in the future this will help us to gather more trackable data and to perfectly know what we did during our correction. And putting this all together, this will, I think, generate more evidence-based surgical corrections. And as mentioned, what we want for the future, I think, for us, incorporate in the software that these measurements will be automatically and faster, and definitely increase the tube height, not only for us in foot and ankle surgery to have a proper alignment of your whole hind foot, but also, I think, for other disciplines in the orthopedics, that will be more interesting for them also. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Berson. I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Francois Lintz, who will be presenting a novel 3D alignment tool.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Guy, and thank you, Professor Richter. It's great to be speaking to you this morning. Thank you for being here, because it is quite early. So this is about a new concept of three-dimensional biometrics for measuring hindfoot alignment using the weight-bearing CT. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but we do realize that two-dimensional measurements really suck, and we want to find something new. So weight-bearing CT is probably the solution, but there is no dedicated tool. And if we want the tool to work, we need it to be automatic, and we need it to be easy to use so that you guys will use it. The tricky thing is that it doesn't exist, so there's nothing to compare that to. So it's quite tricky to study. And what we're doing now is trying to implement two-dimensional tools and angles to a new three-dimensional tool, which is the weight-bearing CT. And that's a bit like trying to find our way through the matrix using a sextant. And it's probably, there's probably other ways to think about this. So we'd had a look previously at this with some research. And this was one of two of the methods that were published that shown that the tibia could be replaced with something that was more meaningful from a biomechanical point of view as a reference line, and that's the forefoot. So that was the ground reaction force calcaneal offset, and Amendola published on the tripod index, which also used elements which were not the tibia. And one of the interesting things was those numbers. If you correlate two measurements inside the foot in 3 dimensions that you know are the true measurements as opposed to two-dimensional measurements, if you use a 3D alignment method, you get a correlation of 0.97. So going back to the Caesar's class correlations, that's first class correlation. It's pretty good. And if you use a standard 2D method, it's 0.78. And actually, I haven't published this, but we ran this data with the new software that I'm presenting here, and the correlation is now 0.999. So it's pretty good. And that means that in treating our patients, in about 20% of cases and more, using these new tools, we will actually not make mistakes in evaluating hindfoot alignment, which we used to do before. So that's really what we're here for, is making better evaluations for our patients and eventually doing better corrections and getting better results. And we all know the literature about the correlation between hindfoot alignment and results in TAR and arthrodesis, that sort of thing. So there's been literature about weight-bearing CT, and this is Professor Richter's paper saying that only PETCAT is able to detect the correct angles Mark Meissen also published more on the other advantages of PET-CAT, radiographic exposure, acquisition time, preoperative and postoperative planning. So what we wanted to do is really to set out and create the new tools that would fit the weight-bearing CT. So there was, we had to define the technical specs for this, and the new measurements would have to be physically relevant. It would have to mean something biomechanically. It would have to be designed for three-dimensional imaging, computerized, and we would have to verify this with data. So it takes a little bit of thinking out of the box, and that's why we wanted to create something new that we call three-dimensional biometrics. And as I said before, testing this is quite tricky because you can't compare it with the old measurements. So the hypothesis for our studies should be that the tool should distinguish between normal and pathological cases, and that the distribution of normal cases should be Gaussian. So that's, if some of you were there yesterday, that's what I already presented. We first find a new line of reference, which is not the tibia, and then we will use for our measurement the offset between where the weight is bearing on the ankle and where the ground reaction force is going through the sole of the foot, because the question really is, what is deforming and what is degenerating our ankles, our patients' ankles? And that's actually torque, and this torque comes from the offset between the line of where the forces are going, the weight and the ground reaction force, and that's the offset we want to measure. And if you look at the foot upside down, okay, that's perfectly valid. You're just looking at the referential from another point of view. It's just like trying to hold a plate on your finger. If the finger is not straight in the middle, the whole thing collapses. And so it's the same thing with your foot. So really measuring this offset has biomechanical meaning. And so this is the offset that we used for this study. And it's the offset between the center of the talus in 3 dimensions and the midline of the foot, where the center of gravity is. And it's the shortest distance between these 2 points. Right, and it's given as a percentage so that it fits, so that the actual values fit any foot regardless of their size. Right, so this is just to make it clear what we're looking at. So this is FAO. This is the offset, right? This is the center of the talus, and I can find a 3D actual valgus. So just imagine this is a valgus case, right? And the center of the talus should be around here if it was neutral. Okay, so the FAO is the offset between where the talus should be if the foot was neutral and its actual position. And the calcaneal offset, which will be in the software, is by how much, it's a bit like your study, how much you should slide the calcaneus to neutralize this offset. And the hindfoot angle, so that is just brand new. It was like we did this with the engineers, and they really did a great job because they did it in just about 48 hours to implement this in the new software. Because when we started presenting this, the question was like, okay, offsets and everything, that's great, but you know, where's the angle? Because you guys actually want to know what the angle is, and you need that if you're going to use the tool. So we decided to implement the angle, and it's basically the same thing as the offset, but expressed as an angle. And the reference point is still the center of the ankle. So this is your hindfoot angle, and the values will be similar to what we already know. Yeah, that was just, yeah. Okay, sorry. And this is how we created the tool. If we can compare it to building a GPS system for the foot and ankle, we used the PET-CAT as a satellite to give us coordinates. And then the software we created is called Talus. And that was to process the coordinates and come up with the value, the foot and ankle offset value. And that's what we call the 3-dimensional biometric. So we got some, we worked with people at RNOH in the UK, and they gave us some data sets, anonymous data sets that we could work on. And the investigator there pinpointed out all the points. So that's the tedious part, and that's the part that's being replaced by the software, which makes it all automatic. So he pinpointed out the center of the ankle, center of the first and fifth met heads, and the calcaneus, and that's the ground weight, the weight-bearing plane. So when you take the slide and you move it up, that's the first 3 points that you stumble upon, and they're the ones that are in contact with the ground. And the Thales software merges these numbers and comes up with a value. And we found that normal cases were the foot ankle offset was 2.3%. So that's a very slight valgus value, and it pretty much resembles what we already know with our 2D measurements. And the various cases were minus 11, and it was highly significant, even though it's only about less than 40 cases. So that's pretty good. And when we get 500 cases, you can imagine how significant that will be. And this is the distribution of the values, and it is for the normal cases, and it is pretty much Gaussian, and it's quite irregular. And what we want to do is to gather as much data as we can, so that this turns into a real nicely shaped bell curve, and we have proper values that fit the general population. I've already said this. So this is the tool, okay, and so it's really the latest version. So that will be implemented with CubeView, the third version of CubeView, which is the built-in software with PetCat. And this you'll love this. It'll save you lots of time, because all you have to do is to just click your 3 points on the plantar plane and click on the center of the ankle, and it gives you the offset. So the offset is here, and okay, we're not used to offsets yet, and we don't really know what that means. So below that, we have the calcaneal offset, which is by how much the calcaneus should be slided to obtain a correction of the offset. And this is the hindfoot angle. This is 32 degrees, pretty big, but it's not a real case. So you can imagine in real case it wouldn't be that much. But the tool is there, and it's waiting for lots of data. And one of our goals here, you can see, you can save all the cases anonymously in a database and export the database and import pathologies. So that means by putting all the data inside this big database that's anonymous, we'll be able to actually build the statistics that goes with these values. And we think that's the future, and that's how we'll get this bell curve. And if you think about it, this is an ultrasound scan on a baby, and that's what they've been, sorry, okay, I'm just finishing on this. That's what they're doing for babies. They're getting the normal values. They don't really care, where the points are, but on average, with many, many values, we know what the norms should be and the standard deviation. And they have tables like this, and they have scales like that, and that's primitive big data, and we want to go beyond that. So thank you. That's the idea.
Thank you, Dr. Lintz. I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Cesar de Cesar Neto from the United States.
Good morning. I'd like to thank you, Professor Richter and Bean, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to show my results. I presented 2 papers yesterday, but I asked permission to Professor Richter to show a video of how we got to the measurements, how we struggled to get to them. And we did 2 very simple things. When we started that, I realized it was very difficult for us. We had to do manually everything. We don't have Dr. Lind's software yet, so we had to do everything manually. And to get to the measurements, it was very difficult. So I said, let's start with the simple questions. Let's first show if the weight-bearing system compared to the non-weight-bearing can show difference in the adult-acquired flat foot measurements that we use daily. And we also thought about, like, is it possible for an orthopedic resident to learn this, to use this? And so we did an inter-observer for different levels of experience just to answer simple questions. since like Linz and Professor Richter said before, like we don't have the normal, we don't know what is the true answer for that. So the first one was just comparing weight-bearing and non-weight-bearing CT examinations. I don't have anything to disclose, but the senior authors have disclosures. So like I said yesterday, so although weight-bearing plane radiographs play an important role, the use of weight-bearing CTs, like the cone beam CT, is rapidly expanding and can potentially help to the understanding of the three-dimensional deformity. So we did an IRB-approved prospective study where we included patients with symptomatic and flexible adult-acquired flat-foot deformity that agreed to cooperate and sign an informed consent. And then exclusion criteria included inability to bear waves, standard contraindications for CT, and rigid deformities. We included 20 patients, 12 males and 8 females, with a mean age of 52 years and body mass index of 30.35 kilograms by square meters. And the patients were scanned with standing weight-bearing and seated non-weight-bearing. Our system is different from curve beam, so it's not a real wave bearing. So one of the legs is, the wave bearing is in the knee, so it's like this. So the patient has to share the wave. And so I will just show examples of the measurements that we did. The 4-foot arch angle in the non-weight bearing and weight bearing images in the same patient, just to show that the arch really collapsed when you put the load, the weight. And so an example of the results, and we show the diamonds with the mean values and the upper and lower confidence intervals. In the right side, we show the histograms for the measurements, and we found statistical significant difference in the weight-bearing images with what tendency for lower angles in the weight-bearing images with excellent inter-observer agreement and first-class intra-class correlation coefficient. And we also did the influence of the reader experience. So 3 readers. One was a board-certified foot and ankle surgeon, orthopedic resident, and a medical student. I'm showing the same measurement just to, and so here's the parallelism plot of the readers, showing the inter-observer agreement between them. 0.98, meaning a first-class inter-observer agreement. And we compared, we did a paired comparison, and for this measurement, we found no difference between the readers. For most of our measurements, we found that it was possible with a training period before starting the project. It was possible for all 3 levels of experience get to similar results. So, like Professor Richter already said, most of the measurements, not the 4-foot arch angle that was described for CT, but most of the measurements we are trying to do in the CT, they are measurements that we use in a 2-dimensional X-ray, and we are trying to apply the same measurements in the CT. I don't, maybe that's not the smartest answer. And when you try to bring this to a 3-dimensional tool, it's not that easy. When you think about it, you say, okay, let's do it. But when you try to do it, it's much more difficult. And in my literature review that I did for starting the projects, what I think it's in general, we are comparing apples to oranges because people are doing the measurements in different positions, and I don't know if we can really compare the results between each of the studies. And just to show how we struggle to get to the measurements, so most of the literature, they try to set the sagittal alignment, the axis, in the line that connects the calc and the second metatarsal. So we try to do that, but every time you change, at least in our software, every time you change the line, the other line also changed. So we try to keep in the line of the second metatarsal here and perpendicular to the floor. After that, you have to find the proper cut to do the measurement, and we did with midpoints. And the definitions for the worst results were when involved the axis of the talus. If you look to different papers, the lines are in different positions. So we use midpoint of the neck and midpoint of the articular cartilage, but if you see the definitions, they are variable. You can find different definitions. The original definition, they use the lateral aspect of the lateral process and the most superior part of the dome. But when you do that, you don't have the first metatarsal anymore. If you use this image, you will have to correct the axis. You can't be parallel to the second metatarsal anymore. For the coronal measurements, we use the line perpendicular to the floor, and we have chosen to use the bimalleolar axis. But you can use different axes, and you will get to different images and probably to different measurements. So just an example, so the 4-foot arch angle, most inferior aspect of the medial cuneiform and most inferior aspect of the fifth metatarsal, and the line and the floor. So it's really manual. It takes time, and just an example of the measurement of the navicular to floor distance. When you do simple measurements like this, linear measurements, of course, the inter-observer and the inter-observer reliability is higher. And the last one, the axial, we try to be parallel to the floor in both planes. But when you get for the talonavicular coverage angle, when you get to the image, you see that it's not the best image to see the talonavicular joint. So you see that we decided to forget about look at this image. So we brought the axis to the axis of the joint, and so we could have a better idea of the uncoverage. And then an example of the measurement. But the main idea here, like I told Professor Richter and Dr. Lintz, is that until we have the software to do this automatically for all the angles, we probably should make an effort to at least set what is the right way of doing, or at least not the right way, but create a pathway for all people that are interested in doing research with this, at least use the same alignments and the same axis so we can compare the results and put the data together. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cesar Dinetto. I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Michael Wakalski from Stuttgart in Germany. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to present our first experience for 6 months now in 97 patients with PET-CAT. I come from the Olga Hospital. It's a big children's hospital, and we are a pediatric orthopedic department, which is also not very small, as you see. These are all people, only orthopedic surgeons that treat pediatric orthopedic patients. And we have a lot of separation because it's so big, and my part is mostly neuroorthopedics, that I'm responsible for gait analysis and foot deformities. And that's right now still the gold standard. We make standing radiographs. We have the problems that are well published, that the X-ray tube may be in different position, the standing position may in different position, and this is quite a normal setting, yes, and if the patient is standing, and everybody who is treating flexible flat foot knows that sometimes the patient, if he has here the X-ray device between the feet, yes, and has a flexible foot, stands pretty normal, yes, and so you get a normal X-ray, but he has a flat foot, and so sometimes we integrate 3D non-weight bearing, but there you can't really see how the joint and the bones are when standing. So we were looking for a device that combines these two, and this was the reason for us to start with PET-CAT, because here you have a relaxed bipedal standing, and the patients still say they are not stressed. They have 3D full weight bearing image. We have pretty low radiation, pretty short examination time. And another thing that was very important, as you really are able to export your data to your local PACS system and work with that. And that's what we get in our PAC system. We got these reconstructions that are integrated by Professor Richter. So you have a view that is pretty similar to your normal X-rays, which we are used to. Then we export a transversal sagittal coronar cuts to the like CT views you have. So you have a pretty view through the normal cuts. Then you have these 3D reconstructions that you can turn. And also like in the PETCAT software, and the PAC system gives the possibility to make 3D planar, multiplanar systems, so you can turn the axis and also turn the 3D vision. So for what is it important? We have now here a patient, 10-year, we made a Grice procedure, and I don't know if you can see it on the reconstruction or the X-rays. You see one bone of the Grice procedure, it's an extra-articular arthrodesis, is resorbed. That happens. The other is a full fusion, but when you look at the normal X-ray, it's always estimating more or less. But here you see in the multiplanar reconstruction, here you see there's no bone, you're sure, and you see here you have a fully bony integration, you're sure, and you have the 3D version where you can pretty see how the static is. Other patient with talonavicular coalizio. You see here, this is before we had the PET-CAT, you had the MRI, and in one side we decided, because it was a big bony fusion, to make an arthrodesis, and we saw the patient later. Then here you see the arthrodesis is fully healed, and the other side we decided, because it was smaller, to do a resection, and here you can see, and you see for sure that it's fully resected. Very important for our patient is the ankle joint, and when you look at normal X-rays, you often can't really see what is the real form of the ankle joint. And here we have a cavus foot, and you see, because of the very dorsal standing of the fibula, you're not sure. But here you can put your multiplanar reconstruction in the ankle joint, and you see you have a pretty good ankle joint. Here you have a residual plumb foot, another patient, and you see here this is severe necrosis and there's no movement in the ankle joint. Another patient who has a ball and socket joint, this you can also see very clearly. Another procedure we perform frequently is in flexible flat foot of young children. We do this extra-articular arthrodesis with a screw, and it's supposed to be the screw between the processus anterior of the talus. But we don't really know if it's really there, and we neither know right now if it's really necessary to be there. This is a patient, also of a neurologic disease, who had the screw in there, no pain, a perfect result, and you see one screw is where we wanted it, the other screw is pretty far more lateral, and I think this will lead our research to get more information where the screw has to be, which leads to problems, and which are problems that we only think about. We have now a full integration, so if we have very complex feet, we look at the clinical things, we look here the Coleman block on the cavus foot, then you may have the pressure distribution and also sometimes foot model in the gait lab. Then we also start to measure, and now we had already a lot of discussion, and I had the same problem, yes, where to put the lines, because the lines are always defined in flat radiographs, and there it's a bit easier because your reference is also always the radiograph. Yes, you only have to put the line in 2 dimensions. Now, every dimension is free, and so still the line in the talus, it was a problem in radiographs too, yes, but when measuring the heel, this is one measurement here where we measured the heel of a severe cavus foot when the axis of the ankle, and we ended up with 8 degrees of valgus. But when you look clinically at the patient, it's the same patient we had before, yes, this patient has clinically a varus. When you measure the same varus in the axis of the foot, he has 8 degrees of varus. So from my point of view, it's really important that we get exact definitions, what we want to measure, what are the planes we refer to, because if not, we get to very, very different measurements. We track mostly children, yes, and when we go to small children, we get to special problems with this examination, because a bipedal PET CAT needs about 60 seconds, and here you see children don't stand still 60 seconds, so we get a lot of motion artifacts. So we are looking forward to faster sequences, yes. And here we have this publication of Ludlow, and we see the smaller the children are, the more high is the effective dose, yes. So we need smaller field and less radiation if we want to track small children too in a large number. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Waskowski. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Richter once more to open the discussion. Thank you.
So, thank you all for speaking. Everybody is very enthusiastic, and we had very nice discussions, but we have almost no time for discussion because in 5 minutes the other sessions will start. But I think maybe we don't make a real discussion, but a conclusion. So the conclusion first is that we don't know exactly what to measure. We learned about the bottom line of measuring angles between bones, that we cannot use the two-dimensional tools to do this in the three-dimensional environment. We have some new ideas with the first and fifth, the arguments metatarsal. The arguments against it are based on dynamic pedography, for example, where the tripod principle has been clearly found out that it's not correct because you have more force in the central metatarsals, for example. There could be an argument against it. We don't know if we have single ped or bipedal stand. We cannot do a dynamic measurement, but we could do a measurement in tiptoe standing and in different parts of the stance phase. We could integrate a pedographic sensor or not. We could decrease the field of the area of the scanning. We could increase the speed of the scanning, and there are so many different things. So and I think for me it's very important that what we do should be. We shouldn't go in the wrong position very enthusiastically. For example, it's wrong to measure angles between the bones. And we have a software that does it in 10,000 patients, and then we realize it's not okay. We have now the tripod system. We have an automatic database. We create 10,000 patients, but then we find out that the tripod is not really the dynamic correlating thing. So in my opinion, the first conclusion for me is that we have enthusiastic scientists here, and we need time to discuss it. And now, unfortunately, we don't have the time, so I'm sure we will not come to a conclusion because we can say this is okay and this is okay and this not. We need time to do this. And in my opinion, we should do this before we start with any automatic kind of software which is gathering data of all our patients, which could be 10,000 per year, and to find out later on that it would have been better to use something else. So I don't know, maybe you can give, maybe Charlie, can I ask you? You are not a PET CAT user yet, but you are I think the most experienced foot and ankle surgeon here. What would you like to have in your practice?
We can't have non-weight-bearing CTs and say anything about alignment. I mean, that's over. I think that's really important. But you've raised all the real questions. You've actually just went down the list of the real questions. What do we want to measure? And how do we know what we're measuring represents reality? Is the center of the talus really the most critical place to say all the weight's going through? Or does it change with position? Obviously it shifts. You know, the center of the talus, where the contact is, shifts as you dorsiflex and plantar flex. But we're going to have to simplify it. We're going to have to make it simple enough so that everyone can use it. So Dr. Lintz's work is amazing. Whether it should be 2 points in the forefoot or 3 points in the forefoot and have a third metatarsal point makes sense to me. But I guess the most important thing is that we, as a group, meet again and again and again on a regular basis, somehow carve out time from all of our busy lives to try to help figure out how to use this in a way that'll help patients, because we're going to get there. I think we're going to get there. It may take a little more technology. It'll take more software technology, but it may take some integration with sensors, like Martinez says, to understand where the weight goes and how that, to truly understand what's going on. But we're going to get there if we keep talking about it and working at it. And we're not going to get there on our own. I'm not going to get there on my own. I guarantee you that. So thank you all. I mean, the work from Belgium is amazing, and actually the work on children's is spectacular. I thank you all for the work you're doing. It's fantastic.
Okay, good. It's a very good last word, not only because we don't have any more time to discuss because the next session is going on. I think it's very good. But the last question would be, who of the surgeons here would be in favor to have a, I don't know how to do this, but I think we need a whole day meeting, maybe attached to one of the upcoming conferences, who would think the effort is worth it to have a one-day meeting discussing all the parameters and defining what we need in the future before or after one of the upcoming conferences. Who does? Oh, it's good. Thank you. So I think we should plan something like this. I don't know exactly how. We have all time constraints, but I think this is the way to go. If we don't do it, nobody will do it. So we must do it. Thank you.